You sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan.
This is Guilherme.
And we're sitting here with Maria Fedorova. Maria, why don't you start us off with telling us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm a PhD student at the University of Vienna. And I work on imagination and its epistemic value, how we can learn things through imagination, come to understand things about ourselves and the world.
Yeah. Do you want to start us off with telling us what imagination is?
Yeah, so I guess I should start by saying that imagination, at least in the way philosophers see it, is a fairly heterogeneous phenomenon. So, for example, in our ordinary talk, we use the word imagination to refer to all sorts of things. We imagine the taste of a vanilla ice cream, the smell of our favorite perfume. We imagine what it's like to be somebody else. We also imagine, what the world would be like if things were different in it. Novelists ask us to imagine worlds different from ours, right? And we also imagine how to climb a rock or how to rotate the Rubik's Cube. So it's a lot. And it can be fairly hard to put a finger on the exact single definition of imagination. But it's not impossible, of course. And there are some basic definitions that certain philosophers provide us with. And my personal favorite is Michael Stewart's definition of imagination as the ability to represent, manipulate, or simulate objects not present to sensory experience. And so this definition, as basic as it is, sort of allows us to draw further distinctions within the field of imagination studies, and also allows us to account for the heterogeneity of imaginings that we observe in life. So, for example, objects not present to sensory experience can mean mental images, and we do naturally associate imagination with mental imagery. But according to some philosophers, I'm not sure I quite agree with them, but according to them, there's also propositional imagination. So, aside from imagining certain mental images, having them as contents of our imaginings, we can also imagine propositions. For example, that Paris is the capital of France, or that Eiffel Tower is in France, things like that. And that kind of makes propositional imagination a bit closer to suppositional kind of reasoning. But yeah, in my work I focus on imagination that involves mental imagery, so I kind of set propositional imagination aside. And yeah, typically philosophers refer to that kind of imagination as sensory or perceptual imagination, and we can discuss what that means later on.
Yeah, what kind of question is driving you?
Yeah, yes, the central question in my dissertation is how we can learn things through the use of imagination. So, for example, I've given a couple of examples of imaginative exercises, like imagining what it's like to be somebody else, or imagining how to climb a rock. And according to those who study epistemology of imagination, when we put imagination into uses in such cases, we try to kind of acquire a certain belief about the world, about ourselves or about other people, or we might also want to try and develop or improve a certain skill, like when we imagine climbing a rock, for example. And in this particular context, for epistemologists of imagination, the central question is what makes learning through imagination possible? And to be more precise, a sort of standard way to formulate the question more precisely is to ask how and whether imagination can serve as a source of justification of our beliefs. That kind of doesn't really apply to skills in a way. Skills, as far as imagination is concerned, has been studied more in cognitive science rather than philosophy. But in philosophy, the standard way of phrasing the question, the core question, is in terms of justification and reliability, because in some branches of epistemology, when we seek a certain source of justification, we're usually after, this source being reliable, that it is conducive to truth, for example, or that it fairly accurately represents the world, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about imagination being used for justification, do you see that as analogous with something like considering justifications or the process of sort of critical thought or analysis? Is this all lumped into imagination for you?
Yeah, I guess in terms of justification, in the way that, if I understand the question correctly, of course. I kind of think there's two ways to answer your question in a way, because, yeah, in traditional epistemology of imagination, that's still a fairly young field, by the way. When people talk about justification, they kind of, in the context of imagination, they sort of like draw an analogy with perception. So, and that's because sensory imagination that I mentioned that I focus on is a kind of perceptual representation, except there is no actual sensory stimulus driving it. And so when people discuss justification for our beliefs, in the case of sensory imagination, they're asking, okay, so can imagination, just like perception, when we perceive things in the world, and therefore are kind of like immediately justified in normal circumstances to believe that they are the way we perceive them, whether we can sort of apply this line of reasoning to imagination as well. Another way to target this question, however, is in terms of reasoning, as you suggested, because there is this philosopher, Joshua Myers, who actually has recently proposed that imagination is more like reasoning rather than like perception. Because, yeah, the natural assumption amongst most philosophers is, as I've said, to consider justificatory powers of imagination in terms of perception, or in the terms similar to those of perception. But Joshua Myers thinks that imaginings are kind of like a certain processes that involve the kind of platitudes that we would normally ascribe to reasoning. So, for example, they consist of three parts, we can say. They start with like a certain input. We start an imagining with a certain input, where, let's say, one part of this input can be, oh, I want to solve a certain problem. So, for example, when I'm playing a Jenga game, that's the example that Joshua Myers gives. When we're playing the Jenga game, we start with thinking to ourselves, okay, so what would be the best way to build a tower without it collapsing? And then that question can serve as part of our starting point in our imaginative process. But of course, it's not all of it. We can also include, the very actual starting point, the content of it, which is like the starting condition of the tower. So that's our input. Then we have the medium state, so to speak, the mediating state, where operating on contents happens, just like in reasoning. And then we have an output state, which is the solution that imagination gives you based on your operations on your initial content. So yeah, that's kind of like a very technical description of the process, but yeah, that's how Josh Myers, for example, sees it. And so hence justification by means of reasoning rather than by means of just quasi-perceptual experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the things that occurs to me is maybe, what do you think about defining imagination as a long gradient with perception, where the point of the gradient you are along is the degree of external stimuli you are perceiving, in that all of it is reconstructed internally. Everything I perceive is reconstructed internally, but typically when we discuss perception, we're discussing the internal reconstruction of external stimuli, and there's always a degree of internal stimuli that's triggered. There's no unbiased perception. So then as you move along the spectrum where the external stimuli is less weighted or moves into not being present at all, you move more towards imagination. Is that something accurate? Like what I'm thinking of is a gradient where a rough analogy would be me perceiving and then me experiencing augmented reality and then me experiencing virtual reality. So there's degrees of external stimulus which are present, and then if that's the case, sort of a second dimension of the question is, what is then the difference between imagination and hallucination?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, okay, so I guess I'll start by saying that, yeah, I hope I won't forget all of the parts of the question. But yeah, so there is this philosopher, Ben Snaney, who has been working a lot on mental imagery and perception and imagination. And he's actually recently proposed in his new book that all perception is at least partly constituted, roughly put, by mental imagery. So in a way, yeah, perception, as you said, is never pure perception, really. There is always a certain addition coming from mental imagery. And yeah, like for example, when there is occluded parts of certain objects that we see, if we don't see when we perceive a cat in a box, we don't perceive just like half of the cat. We perceive the whole cat, and that's because mental imagery is doing this kind of like reconstructing work for us. To give an example, and he considers many others, and on his view, mental imagery, but he kind of understands mental imagery in a very basic sense that it's like kind of like a perceptual representation that can be conscious or unconscious, doesn't really matter. We can trace it by focusing on certain activations of certain like brain regions that are normally activated when we perceive things, and so on. And so basically he kind of like that's sort of like his view. But I just thought I would start that off with that because it's kind of like it's one radical extreme in a way, because for him all cognition is kind of dependent on mental imagery to some extent, including perception and mental imagery and memory, all sorts of things, including language, are all very closely tied together. So that's one thing, and in a way, there is no way to avoid mental imagery being present. But I really liked your way of putting it in terms of kind of like that being a spectrum in a way, from actual reality to kind of like virtual reality. And in this sense, I guess like one way to think of this would be to say, so when we imagine things, oftentimes the environment, the external environment, is at least partly directly present in our imaginings, in the sense that, for example, when I'm sitting here at this table, and let's say the table is part of the external stimulus, but let's say I'm imagining a red apple on it right now, and here it's kind of like we have like a borderline case where the external stimulus is contributing to my imagining or to my appeal to a certain type of, visual, in that case, mental imagery, and they're kind of like mashed together. And I think some philosophers, in fact, argue that our environment and, our embodiment in it as concrete agents essentially contributes to things that we imagine, to the kind of features that are salient to us both in our imaginings and in reality. And so there is like sort of like no straightforward way to delineate between all of these. However, I think that doesn't actually, to me at least, it seems that it doesn't necessarily pose a challenge when it comes to distinguishing, at least, maybe not so sharply, but still distinguishing between imaginings, hallucinations, and other perceptual representations. And in fact, the definition that I gave at the very beginning of our discussion by Michael Stewart of imagination as the ability kind of allows for this distinction, because we can say, for example, that perception proper, hallucinations, imaginings all include mental imagery. But the fact that they have mental imagery as as part of their content doesn't mean, of course, that they're all the same as capacities. And so in a sense, for example, one way to distinguish between hallucination and imagination or imaginings would be to say, so since imagination is a certain type of ability, it presupposes it's a kind of disposition, right, that we can exercise at will. That's how, at least, I would think some philosophers would put it. So that can, like imagination can be, or perhaps even should be, I'm actually not so sure about it, should be to some extent intentional. I start my imagination, my imaginative process. The way it unfolds depends on many things and many other factors other than my own intentions, of course, and it'll be constrained by things that have nothing to do with my intentions. That being said, the fact that I start my imagining with a certain intention to imagine a certain thing, or to come to learn a certain thing through my imagination, would kind of like put a certain limit, or limit the cases of various mental processes that we would actually qualify as imaginings. Because hallucinations, for example, many hallucinations include all sorts of like mental images spanning across all sense modalities, like we have audio hallucinations, we have visual hallucinations, and so on and so forth. But of course, we don't bring them at will. They just emerge, so to speak, in fact, against our will. And often in cases of mental disorders, for example, they continue to haunt people, of course, without them intentionally bringing them about to their consciousness, for example. So I guess in terms of, that's how I would try and distinguish between the through.
Yeah.
Can I get a little bit more into the intentionality?
Yeah,
Because I
that's
have been
exactly it.
thinking about dreaming as well,
Mhm.
so that's out of the question. But then I thought about daydreaming, or
Mhm.
just, suddenly get back that memory inside of your head very involuntarily.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, I would call it involuntarily. I don't know how would you do about that, because it's interesting. It's interesting what you're saying. So I see a little bit of putting a little bit of functionality on imagining. But what would you say that is? How would you? In which box would you put daydreaming, or just this suddenly emergence of images in your head that you don't bring about to fulfill a function? Specifically, I'm air quoting here the
Mhm.
word
Mhm.
function.
Mhm. Oh, I really like that question, in fact, because daydreaming and mind wandering has always been the kind of topic that I've been interested in myself on the side, and I've not done a lot of research on that. Sort of just kind of like contemplating the topic, and of course, if I were to sort of try and reflect on my experiences of daydreaming, for example, with an appeal to introspection, so to speak, many of our daydreamings, if you think about it, of course, kind of like occur, not against our own will, probably, I wouldn't say that, but they do occur sort of like almost spontaneously in a way. As far as I know, daydreaming often occurs, especially like at the resting state, when you're kind of like bored, when you're just like, I don't know, driving on a bus or going somewhere, and then you just start daydreaming and your mind goes wandering around. So in a way, you don't necessarily start daydreaming intentionally. I would think you can, though. Like, not all of your daydreamings and not all of your cases of, just like... Because daydreaming often kind of like clashes with just like thinking about stuff. Reflecting on certain things. To me, at least, these things are not so clearly or sharply distinguished when you're trying to solve a certain problem in your head, for example, which is where imagination comes in, of course, as well, because you can start a daydream, for example, just having like a certain problem on the back of your mind, and then you'll start imagining a certain scenario. I would still count it as an imagining, I guess, even though you don't intentionally start it as in this functionalist or functional or technical terms that I described it before. So that's one thing. Another thing, now that I'm just sort of just like, thinking out loud about this, at least, though, I would think that you can stop daydreaming, unlike with hallucinations, right? So that would kind of, I would think in most cases you can, at least to some extent, avoid daydreaming when you don't want to daydream. I would hope. Probably. Maybe not to the full extent. I'm actually not sure about that. But certainly it seems like their daydreams wouldn't be as resistant or stubborn as hallucinations, at the very least. And also hallucinations, as far as I know, normally present themselves as part of reality. You ascribe a certain like real status to them, whereas daydreams, you still are aware that they're unreal in the strong sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of intention is, for me, the tricky one, in that I definitely accept its functional purpose, right? Discussing intention and will in the conversation about imagination and hallucination. I don't really accept it as a valid capacity. Right, like the invocation of will, I don't quite ascribe validity to it, but I do accept it as a very functional term, especially when trying to make delineations between concepts which I think don't have clear or natural distinctions, like imagination and hallucination and perception. It probably forms a bit more of a triangle, in that, in the same way, you don't really stop a daydream, in that once it's over, you realize you had been daydreaming. You kind of, the moment you stop it is when you realize that you had been daydreaming, which is kind of an interesting thing. And in the same way that you can invoke hallucinations, and that you can put yourself in a state where you're bringing hallucinations on, and you can be in a place where you are experiencing hallucination and recognize the hallucination and say, I'm just hallucinating this, which is also kind of true I suppose, perception in general, which is why I think the boundary gets quite blurry whenever we sit and think about the difference between whether or not we're hallucinating reality or we're perceiving the external world. So it's useful, I think, to me at least, to make distinctions between perception, hallucination, and imagination. But I do think that it is important to keep in mind, for me at least, the gradient along which they exist, and that the point at which we draw the line is a bit more, it's not arbitrary, but it has a theoretical use. There's a functional delineation, I would say, more than a natural delineation.
Yeah, certainly. I completely agree with that. Because, yeah, in a way, I should say I use the term intention, and most certainly will, but also intention. Because both of these are, of course, folk psychological terms. And when I use them, I don't really presuppose the existence of, actual mental states that we would be able to describe as such. So yeah, it's in a way, it's just, this is a certain term of art to help us delineate the cases that we would be interested in. So for example, in the epistemology of imagination, the reason why people would be interested more in intentional imaginings, even though some actually, including Michael Stewart, say that anarchic imagination, non-intentional imaginings, can be very useful for scientists as well, epistemically speaking. But most philosophers are interested, in intentional imaginings, loosely understood, for a very specific reason, and that's because historically imagination, again, and actually perhaps we should have emphasized it at the very beginning, imagination is also, in a way, a folk psychological term, right? It's not really a scientific term. But yeah, historically, many philosophers, for example, Wittgenstein and Sartre, were skeptical about the epistemic value of imagination because they thought of it as intentional. So the skeptical argument, which basically started off the whole discussion in the contemporary epistemology of imagination, was that imagination cannot deliver any epistemic goods. That is, we can't learn anything from imagination because it is up to us. So the idea being is that we can imagine, which is a very naive kind of argument, and of course that's recognized by contemporary philosophers, but it was still kind of like the main argument to address. That's how, as I've said, the whole discussion started, because they were saying like, imaginings are up to us in the way that like, we can imagine whatever we wish to imagine, which is the kind of claim that could be very severely contested, of course. But that's what they thought originally, that there is certain contents that we can put into our imaginings. These contents are chosen by us. We imagine it, and because we imagine what we already know, because we're the ones who choose the contents for our imaginings, we can't learn anything from them. That was the argument, which is a silly argument, if you ask me, because of course it doesn't really imply, even under the assumption that we can choose contents of our imaginings, that doesn't imply that we can't learn anything new from them. And that's basically the central claim that contemporary philosophers have been trying to defend. So I think there is a certain historical, functional, in a way, justification for why philosophers choose to focus on what we would call, folk psychologically speaking, intentional imaginings.
So I guess two quick things. One, the first is, if I walk past somebody on the street, and the fragrance that they have on makes me think of my grandmother, and then that takes me to a thought of the last time I saw my grandmother, and then the conversation we had, and then I think, oh, actually I meant to call her on Tuesday. So this whole thought process isn't intentional. I'm sort of driven along, right, on a series of thoughts, which is, to me, I think, a lot of my sensory experience, right? I see things and thoughts occur. And so one question is that also what you consider within imagination, or is it purely that, when I look at a Rubik's Cube and attempt to manipulate it with my mind, or Jenga or things like this? And then the second part is one of the arguments that you advance, that imagination is useful, which I think it is. If I'm sitting in my chair and I read a line from a paper, And then I sit back, and for the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm working out an idea. I'm integrating the idea that I read, and it sparks new ideas in my mind. I work to adjust that into what I already believe. Maybe it's a thought that's completely separate or even opposing the line that I read in the paper. That sort of mental work that produces something new. It could produce a novel thought. Is that also imagination?
Yeah, I was also thinking about the relationship between imagination and creativity.
Yeah, we can touch upon. I feel like those two, creativity and imagination, and imagination and thought. Of course, these two questions are related, but I would still kind of like, when I try to answer them, I would separate the two.
Mm-hmm.
So I think actually this question brings forth to another distinction that's often drawn in philosophy, and more specifically, it was recently formulated by Peter Langland-Hassan, who suggests that we can sort of like, so for him, first of all imaginings are thoughts. That's the first thing. So in a way, and many philosophers and cognitive scientists who are kind of like, philosophers of cognitive science, I would rather think, agree that when we speak of imagination, we mean imagistic thought or imagistic cognition. So that's one thing. And I'll clarify in a second how we can understand that. But first, let's just consider Langland-Hassan's distinction, namely between imagistic imaginings and attitude imaginings. So we can understand his distinction between the two in a way, in terms of the original definition of imagination that I gave, in that it's kind of like Langland-Hassan definition sort of like zooms the basic definition that we have in a little bit. So he basically says, on the one part, we have imagistic imaginings that are more like what I've called mental images. So it's kind of like images that are also very like closely connected to various thoughts that we have. That just like, we are driving somewhere and we are thinking, and our thoughts are somehow sort of like meshed with our certain images, memories, novel images, whatever. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like this whole mass of thought in a way happening, and they're not very elaborated or anything, not necessarily. So it's just, thoughts, mind wandering, daydreams, anything would count. And then there is attitude imagining. And attitude imagining is rich elaborated thought about the possible. That's how Langland-Hassan defines it. And I guess his sort of second definition would be good for it can help us explain what happens in the later case that you were describing. So when you read a certain piece of paper or you read a line, and then you're trying to work out what it means, what it entails, what it implies, and so on and so forth. You might appeal to certain images, for example, if you want to visualize a certain idea. You don't have to do that necessarily, but you would be trying to like build on the material you've been given to work your way towards a certain conclusion, for example, some sort of like novel conclusion based on what you read. And presumably, I would think Peter Langland-Hassan would consider it to be, the case of attitude imagining. Because on his view, it doesn't have to include mental imagery. It can be just propositional thought in a way. Which is kind of curious because, I feel like all of these distinctions, in a way, collapse our ordinary understanding of imagination very easily. And it can become really hard to kind of like, just create a certain more or less comprehensive image of what imagination really is. But I think that's the whole point of Peter Langland-Hassan's book explaining imagination, because he's like basically arguing that there is no such thing, strictly speaking, as imagination. Imagination is just a compilation of beliefs. Well, he's a folk psychological philosopher, so for him it's beliefs, desires, intentions, and images. All of these other states, be it perceptual representations like mental images, or non-perceptual representations like beliefs. All of these make part of what we in our ordinary talk would call imaginings, but there is no such thing as imagination ultimately as a separate kind of mental phenomenon. Hence, such close relationship between imagination and thought, between other forms of perceptual representations, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I feel like hopefully that answers your question to some extent. At least that's how I would try and sort of like, conceive of a possible answer. But yeah, with creativity and imagination, would you like to elaborate on this question?
Yeah, just throw it in, but I can. I'm reading a book again, the same book in creativity, and how it aids the evolutionary process of our species. And it's very interesting, but it always get me thinking over and over, and how and then how, in this case, would imagination fits the story, in the sense that at some point, an ancestral species within our evolutionary tree looked at a rock and saw a tool inside of it.
Mm.
You know, you had to create that image of how that rock would do a better work on cutting something or doing spearing something. And I was curious to get you there, to try to know what would you, or how would you fit imagination on an evolutionary process? Maybe not directly, but or how would you think about it? Seeing things. Well, I think the best example that I can throw just now is the tool use or the rock, but I think it can fit many, because like as in this book, like the idea is that is to bring creativity, and it says, look, there was these problems, and then we took all of the bits that we know about the environment, and then we recreate those bits together in a different way. So that's what is described as creativity. So you take the bits that you know, and then you create a new form and shape out of them. Not physical, but like problems, things like society and things. Like there's kind of things that exist. I can reshape those things and then get something different out of it. Mm. But I have to imagine those things.
I'm gonna add one thing. Question for you: is it just reshaping, or is it also a different function for a previous device?
Yes, different functions.
Okay, cool.
As well.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's kind of like curious that the book that you were talking about focuses on the notion of creativity, and of course I can certainly see how, of course, creativity comes into the picture, well, in terms of novelty and novel production. But strictly speaking, coming from the literature where I'm coming from, I would think the process you were describing is exactly that of imagination, because in discussions of creativity and imagination in philosophy more specifically, philosophers distinguish between imagination as contributing, as a certain capacity contributing to the acquisition and production of novel creative goods, and creativity being a certain feature that's kind of it's a certain feature. For example, we can think about it as a virtue ascribed to people. Okay. And to the products that they produce. Mm-hmm. For example, a certain product is creative, or a certain person is creative. And we can understand creativity then as a certain epistemic value, or as a certain epistemic virtue that we have, sort of it can be inherently virtuous or inherently valuable. It can also be conditionally or instrumentally valuable, in that, it helps us navigate the world. So that's creativity in philosophy, whereas imagination seems to be more like something that helps us achieve creativity as a final product, in a way, or as a final good that we are striving for. That's how I would think about it. One other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of evolution, which is something I don't really know other than on a very basic level, that as much as I would assume psychologists and scientists know about evolution. But interestingly enough, when it comes to mental imagery and evolution, Ben Stanley, whom I mentioned before, actually discusses imagistic cognition and mental imagery as being crucial for our understanding of the human mind, because it's evolutionary prior to linguistic cognition or language-based cognition. And in fact, in the book that I mentioned before on mental imagery, he argues that one of the major issues in philosophy of mind that basically sort of stretches across the 20th century and the 21st century is that people think that we should focus on language to understand, on the use of language, on the terms that we use to refer to various mental states to understand how the mind works, whereas in fact well, ironically, of course, we need to understand the kind of cognition that's more basic to understand the human cognition, and specifically language as the final product of evolution in a way, because human minds, just like other non-human animal minds that exhibit imagistic cognition, for example, they're successive in a way, and they are deeply interconnected, of course. So I think that's in terms of evolution in a way, yeah, we can think of imagination as being kind of like crucial for our understanding of how human mind is connected to the rest of the species and how it evolved the way it did.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of like going in a different direction.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how human and non-human imagination differs?
No, I've never worked on non-human imagination myself, so I don't think so.
No problem.
Yeah, I guess we can think of. I was thinking about creativity as something like an output, whereas imagination is something like the process. I don't know if that also makes sense to you.
No, it's the book uses imagination and creativity interchangeably.
Okay, that makes
at some
sense.
point, of course, but the name of the book is
creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is actually like a bit sexier in the sciences to say creativity rather than imagination.
Yeah, I think
So
so.
yeah,
I think so.
there's a lot of creativity research. So then, how are you using this work, or what's next? What are you primarily arguing? What's the argument you're advancing, rather?
How can we learn
Yeah.
imagination?
So basically, currently I'm focusing on the question of how imagination, as we've discussed, intentional imagination that's used for specific learning purposes, how it is constrained by other cognitive capacities or by our cognitive architecture in general. Because, in the epistemology of imagination, one of the central arguments for how we learn things from imagination is to say that we do learn from imagination when imagination is properly constrained by, in folk psychological terms, by our previous knowledge or by our previous beliefs, in more or less sort of like cognitive science-based terms, on the kind of priors we have that could guide our imaginings. So that's what I'm, broadly speaking, focusing on right now, how various prior beliefs we have and how various other dispositions we have, as more specifically embodied agents, can help us learn things through imagination. And that's a really rich topic in many ways.
Can you give us an example
of constraining?
Yeah.
So I guess let's just to make it fairly clear where I'm coming from with this, and then we can get a bit more technical. But the basic folk psychological idea in imagination studies would be to say that so suppose I want to learn with the help of imagination whether a sofa the sofa I've just found in IKEA would fit in the room, in my flat. And here I have a bunch of beliefs about the objects I'm concerned with that can help me imagine in the way that would accurately represent the world and therefore would help me advance a certain knowledge. So I have a belief, let's say, roughly I have a belief about the size of the sofa. I have several beliefs about the layout of my room, where I want to put the sofa in, and so forth. There are also, of course, some other beliefs that I might have, like beliefs about the color of the sofa or the colors that are present in my room. Those are not very relevant, of course, because the question is how to fit the sofa in the room. And so hence the only relevant beliefs we would be concerned with would be the size, the layout of the room, and, kind of like these technical aspects. And so these beliefs, provided they're true or justified, it really depends on the kind of epistemological framework you subscribe to, and we don't really need to get into this. Let's just say the kind of beliefs that are true. If you have true beliefs about how the sofa looks like, what the size of it is, and if you have a true belief about the layout of your room, you'll be able to deduce, let's say, from your imagining the sofa in the room, whether it would fit or not. So that's the basic example that I would give in folk psychological terms of how epistemologists of imagination think about it. But then others who have more background in cognitive science have recently suggested that instead of using folk psychological terms, we should rather turn to more technical terms and understand the so-called imaginative constraints, that's the term of the art, in terms of, prior probabilities. And the way they normally talk about imaginative constraints in terms of prior probabilities has to do with the connections between imagination and perception.
Mm-hmm.
So I have one sort of pedantic point, I suppose. It's really a question of how it's framed, but so when you say a constraint, it's almost like the assumption, and I understand the use of the term is functional, but it's almost like the assumption is that there's some kind of boundless imagination, and all that we can do is tap into a limited portion of it.
Yeah.
As opposed to it's facilitated only by what the agent already has. So in one sense, there is a boundless space and the agent has a narrow purview into it. And in the other, the limited space is constructed purely by the agent themselves. And I'm wondering how you see it. Is it that I can understand the continued use of constraint anyway, but do you see it as imaginative constraints or facilitated imagination?
Can you elaborate a bit more on facilitated imagination?
So
like a scaffolded.
Yeah,
something.
it's either that imagination is an open field and my beliefs constrain the aspects of the field that I can see, or it's that the field doesn't exist. The field only exists in the space via the beliefs that I have. So it's not that the priors are only limiting, it's that they actually construct the space itself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, to be sure, I totally see the pedantic point here, the importance of it, but I would say that it's kind of like, I guess it's just a problem of the use of certain terms, because what is meant by imaginative constraints, I would think, is rather the later, namely that, there is a certain scope of knowledge that we have, and it constructs. Yeah, maybe that's actually a better term, but I have a possible argument against it, actually. But I'll mention it quickly in a second. But generally speaking, I would say, the kind of prior knowledge, if you will, that we have, that constructs the space of our imaginative or imaginary possibilities, is what's understood by imaginative constraints. But I would also say that one of the reasons why we might want to sort of keep the term constraint, aside from its historical heritage or whatever, would be because would have to do with the fact that it's not just that, and I don't think it only, from my understanding, I don't think it only applies to imagination, it applies to perception and other cognitive capacities as well, in that the kind of prior probabilities we have that guide our perception, our imaginings, our thought more generally, and so forth, are not only enabling, they're also limiting and constraining. And that's one of the major issues in imagination studies, in fact. That's more specifically the kind of problem I'm focusing on right now, which is the problem that arises from the fact that we can only imagine insofar as we can only imagine things based on what we know, what we've experienced, and so on and so forth, and certain experiences that we've never experienced, or the kind of experiences we will never experience in virtue of being just who we are, limits the space of, experiential and imaginative possibilities for us. Like, for example, if you have a different social identity, for example, if you're a man and you're trying to imagine what it's like to have certain experiences for a woman, your scope of imaginative possibilities will be limited by the kind of knowledge and the kind of experiences you've had yourself. So I think it's kind of like, that's why perhaps in some cases it would be good to speak of prior probabilities that construct imaginative spaces, but in some other cases it kind of like depends on what we want to focus on. But I think the notion of constraint reveals certain gaps or certain specific limitations in imagination that are quite that seem to be quite significant for those who want to argue that imagination is very epistemically useful.
Yeah, I think I'm realizing we're just striking on sort of a realist, anti-realist, idealist distinctions here. Because if the knowledge of being a woman exists out in the world, then I'm constrained from accessing it due to the fact that I'm a man, versus a position that whatever version of being a woman I can imagine is constructed purely on the fact that I have certain beliefs and experience existing as a man. So, I mean, I agree with you. Maybe it's not the most productive avenue of discussion, but I do. I like your response. But I think it's an interesting thing that it touches upon of whether we see imagination as giving us access to a world of things we otherwise don't experience, or just in fact constructing a version of things we only have the ability to imagine based on our prior experience.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point to make, because I'm kind of like thinking, I haven't thought about how it touches upon the question of realism, anti-realism/idealism, because in a way, when I say, for example, that the fact that I'm a woman, or the fact that, for example, we can also consider a different example, right? For what kind of experiences a person of color experiences would be different from the kind of experiences a white person would have. And the embodiment, the kind of different sort of embodiment that these two people, for example, have, would constrain their imaginings and the kind of things, or constrain the space for their imaginings, making certain features more salient to them. So again, when, let's say, I, as a white person, try to imagine what it's like for a person of color to be fearful or wary of a policeman, although probably as a woman I understand it to some extent as well, but it's still not the same, given various historical differences and societal differences. Certain features that are available to the person of color would not be available to me. And I'm not sure it has to do with the world of objective fact as much as it does with the contributions of our just bodies being central locus of our experiences to the way we recognize the world, perceive it, effectively respond to it, and imagine it.
There's and I think that maybe brings us into the notion of empathy, and whether imagination facilitates that. Is that something you want to touch upon as well?
Sorry?
The notion of empathy and whether imagination facilitates empathy or not, whether it accurately facilitates empathy, whether we're able to learn anything about the experiences of others, even if we can learn that what we learn is that the experience is fundamentally different and that we cannot understand it truly. So I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah, right. So there's been a long discussion on that in the epistemology of imagination and in mind-reading discussions, and in many sorts of like adjacent fields in philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology. And up until very recently, the more or less kind of like the consensus was that imagination is crucial for empathy, that in fact it is empathetic imagination rather that we should be thinking about when we think about empathy and how it's facilitated. And that's because, it's kind of the natural assumption that philosophers make here is that, so when there is somebody who experiences something and I see them experiencing it, all I have to do is put myself in their shoes and just kind of like, imagine what it would be like if it was me who was experiencing it. And of course, there are certain difficulties. It's not that simple, even for those who are optimistic about this. Of course, there's certain difficulties having to do with like perspective shifting, how it happens, how it's facilitated, what's required for perspective shifting, whether I imagine myself being other, whether I imagine the other, all sorts of distinctions that are quite important on the face of it. But still the consensus was kind of like, we can't have empathy in a way without imagination. But recently that view has been contested and put into doubt by quite a few different philosophers focusing on very different things, if you think about it. So one, for example, is the argument from disability studies that suggests that it actually draws on the idea that our experiences are so limiting that there is no way we can imagine perspectives that are vastly different from our own perspective, because there is nothing in our scope of imaginative possibilities that would enable that. There is just nothing to scaffold from, in a way, because it's just, that was the idea, it's completely inaccessible. And similarly, in fact, philosophers in this very branch also argue that we can't imagine our future selves either, for the exact same reason that imagining, for example, being a parent, for them is completely inaccessible to us, precisely because there is nothing in the scope of our imaginative possibilities that can facilitate our imaginative process. Sort of, that's kind of like reverse empathy, empathizing with yourself in a way, or imagining yourself being other. Again, it's kind of the same process involved. And one of the central arguments that, to specify this a little bit, that has been very recently advanced by Clavel Vasquez and Clavel Vasquez in 2023. I'm not sure about how to pronounce their name, but I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Anyway, they argue for imaginative inaccessibility of different perspectives from robust embodiment. And so for them, the kind of embodiment we have, our situation in the world, socio-political situation including, shapes us as concrete agents, and more specifically shapes the kind of dispositions we would have as concrete agents. So that includes the kind of beliefs we have about the world, the kind of emotions we experience when we interact with the world, and the kind of experiences we just generally tend to have. So our embodiment, in a way, to put it roughly, shapes the kind of priors we have. So there is like a certain continuity between the two. And I should say they actually, they are confident that predictive processing that exploits the term priors is compatible with embodied cognition. And but that's kind of like a separate topic that we could, not necessarily, but we could touch upon later. But so basically their idea is that there is embodiment, there is the dispositions that we have in virtue of this embodiment, and we can only imagine insofar as our embodiment and our dispositions go. And hence, because a socio-historical situation and the embodiment of a white middle-class man determines the kind of dispositions this person has, for example, not feeling vulnerable when, and that's the example that they use, not feeling vulnerable when he sees a policeman on a dark street at night, or just, never looking never looking back when he's walking on any street, just because he's never had the experience of being scared or vulnerable in the world, which I wouldn't generalize as far, but let's just, for simplicity purposes, we can describe this case like that. And so when this man tries to genuinely understand what it's like for a woman or for a black person, let's say, what it's like for them to experience being vulnerable on a dark street and not being calmed down by a policeman on the street either, because policemen are also potentially threatening and dangerous. When he tries to imagine that, his imagining will be very, very limited, radically limited by his embodiment and the kind of features that would become salient to him when he imagines a certain interaction with the world, as if it happened from the perspective of a woman or of a black person, for example. And from that they conclude that it's kind of like, they don't say it's not impossible to come to understand the perspectives of others. They're doubting whether it's through imagination that we come to understand them, whether imagination is enough, which is kind of fair in a way, because what we might need is testimony, for example. What might also help is our engagement with art, and many other things. I think another case, for example, that could be valuable for us to consider is the case of psychedelic therapy. And we could touch upon this a little bit later. I'll just throw it in there, because, in a way, this kind of imaginative scaffolding where we try to break out of the constraints of our cognitive architecture and imagination can also happen in psychedelic therapy, for example. But I'll just stop right there. And
I don't know if you, I think you throw me around a a couple times now what you said, because I was trying to figure out how good is imagination on making us understand someone else's perspective, on so how effective it is, and if trying to understand how good it is, okay, in general, right? So my idea is that we cannot imagine the same thing, right? So we cannot like the imaginations are different, or the image or whatever, but there might be some kind of overlapping. I was thinking about the kind of epidemiology of representations, right? So you said that a black man would have this they would imagine something that would be the outcome of being in a dark alley with a police guy passing by. So two black men would have the same kind of outcome, right? They have the same environment. They grew up in a society and where they see that things happen like that. So how close are their representations of this outcome? How close are their mental image of what's going to happen to them there? Is there any overlapping? Or I don't know. I was thinking also, when you're talking about embodiment, maybe then I just derail completely, because I'm interested on the social aspect of it, right? So there is a research on joint action, for example, and where there is a co-representation of things. So that's representation, how we call imagination or mental imaging and cognitive science. And I was just thinking, just like collaborative sports, on where there is a football, guy is running with the ball and he's going to kick the ball, and the other guy knows what that ball is going to do, and then he's going to jump and hit the ball with his head. So both guys running together, they kind of have to imagine the outcome of that thing. But I don't think there's any overlapping between their imaginations, although they have the same experience of how strong you kick a ball, how far the ball goes. I think the same thing goes for like the social aspect on outside of the sport as well. So mental images are never the same. There is a degree of overlapping. There may be epidemiology of those representations. How good does it make us to empathize then? How make it good? How good, if they're different, how can we access the perspective of someone else? The way that someone else feels in the world, the way that they imagine the world.
Yeah, so of course, I don't think that people who have some basic shared embodiment and some shared experiences would have the same mental images. Yeah. I absolutely agree with that, just in virtue of the fact that, different people are different people, and every individual has their own individual experiences. And of course, there should be some overlap because we live in a society and there's shared experiences for us. But the way we then come to conceptualize or reflect on our experiences would be different, and many other things would be different. And two black men presumably might have had a different upbringing. For example, they might have gone to different universities, and they might be interested in completely different things, just like all other people. And of course, they would imagine certain things differently, even if the target or the object of their imaginings is the same. I would think, just like in sports, for example, one way I suppose to kind of bring first to this point would be to think about, when there is a climber and a mature climber, and then a novice, and then a professional climber, even though they both have had experiences of climbing and they do have some shared knowledge of how to climb, their imaginings of climbing, just as their actual climbing experiences, will be different, just in virtue of still them having somewhat different knowledge and somewhat different expertise and somewhat different priors. And I guess that would apply to other cases as well. That being said, though, I would think that in social cases, of course, it really depends on, again, what our aims are and what we want to focus on, right? Because if we want, of course, we're all very different, but it doesn't mean that, and of course, I don't think there is any sort of direct access to perspectives of other people. And there is even enough, I suppose, distance between you and your self-image and all of that. So there's always going to be a certain distance between your own perspective and the perspective you try to imagine. But I don't think that necessarily means that you can't learn anything from it or you can't understand anything about a certain perspective. Because, yeah, again, as Clavel-Vasquez and Clavel-Vasquez, for example, recognize, how we evaluate the epistemic usefulness of imagination depends on, what we want to achieve through it. If it is understanding to a certain degree what it would be like to be somebody else, not necessarily with all of details, not necessarily including all of the past background of the person. Let's just say like some basic experience, what it means to feel vulnerable or scared or angry or whatever in this specific environment in which people are situated. Then that would work. If, however, on the other hand, we want to fully embrace a perspective that's completely different from ours, that's where certain difficulties come in, I suppose. So yeah, it really depends also like on what we want to include in our imaginative processes. Again, as I've said, whether testimony should be a part of an imaginative process or our attempt to improve our skill of imagination and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's kind of, I'm rambling a little bit, but that's how I would try and think about it.
Yeah.
Partly.
Yeah, I can't imagine imagination being useful without something like testimony, especially with regard to empathy. But yeah, I can see how imagination plays a crucial role. But if we limit imagination to imagination without any external input, any other information, then I can see how it wouldn't be productive at all, I suppose. So a brain in a vat with no stimuli probably wouldn't have too many productive thoughts. But yeah, that's interesting. So how do you think about that? Do you think of imagination purely, because if they're making that argument, they're thinking imagination sans other input, right? And they're thinking, okay, well, there's imagination plus the input, other information, people's testimony, maybe discourse, and are those not then used by imagination to take further steps, or are they making a delineation between, consideration that happens after input and just blanket imagination that happens before?
Yeah, so I personally, tentatively, would think about it in the following way. So we start with a certain background of a certain person who is trying to imagine a certain experience. This background is something that, as we've said, construct a certain space of imaginative possibilities for the person. Let's say, when sticking to Clavel-Vasquez and Clavel-Vasquez example, let's start with a white man trying to imagine a certain experience that a woman would have. So he starts with his own embodiment, with his own dispositions. That's clearly not enough to imagine fairly well what the woman might be experiencing, why she's afraid of going home alone at night, for example. But then he thinks to himself, okay, so it seems like my experience is very limited, and that's a very natural assumption to make, a very virtuous assumption to make, I would think. We start with practicing some epistemic humility in this regard. And the second step would be to ask, so could you share your experiences with me? What is it that you've experienced in the past that makes you feel like you can't go home alone on the street? A fairly naive question, but let's just put it in this kind of simple terms. And so then the woman would reply and describe her past experiences to him. And if he listens carefully and if he tries to sort of take on board what she's saying without at the same time, and that would be the most difficult part, without trying to, sort of scrutinize her experiences through his own perspective, because again, that would be in a way quite limiting, I suppose. So if he succeeds in that, if he succeeds in taking on board her testimony, and then the third step would be to try and imagine again, but based on the testimony and his past experiences together. So that would be something that Amy Kind, for example, calls imaginative scaffolding, with a twist, with a certain twist. Well, I would add a certain twist to it, because for her, imaginative scaffolding is the kind of thing that you do when you try to leverage the experiences you've had, the knowledge you've acquired and accumulated, in order to get to the imagining of experiences that you've never had. And naturally, aside from your own experiences, you need testimony and other input, I guess, from the external world, loosely understood, of course, and from other people in order to be able to imagine novel things. I suppose that kind of like very, very briefly touches upon creativity as well, in a way, that we've discussed before. But so that would be this third step for you to use the stuff that you've just acquired. The man would be like, okay, so I have experiences that I've had, my past knowledge. Now I have some extra knowledge that I've got from my friend, and now I can imagine better. So that would be this kind of like, threefold process in a way. Very roughly put, of course, I'm simplifying how it would actually unfold. But that's how I would think about it, I suppose. So in a way, I guess one thing that I would add before I stop is that the knowledge that you get from other people through testimony, for example, or the knowledge you get from novels, for instance, also about other people and about their psychology, folk psychology, of course, the kind of knowledge that we would get, plus your past experiences, might still not be enough to imagine something that's epistemically valuable and that reveals something epistemically valuable about the perspectives of other people, or the perspective of your future self, for example. Because one other thing that's required here in a way, and that's kind of like, that's my very tentative thought, I haven't elaborated on it yet for myself even, but my tentative thought would be to say that aside from these, there would also, for successful imaginative scaffolding, we would also need to get rid of some of the past beliefs that we have accumulated, because presumably when two people come together to discuss their experiences, especially if they have different embodiment, if they have different priors, I would imagine there's also certain experiences that they've had in the past, or certain beliefs that they have that clash or contradict each other, and in a way that might really kind of like, might hinder the process of imagining a different perspective. So we would then need to, break out of the constraints on imagination, and hence actually the usefulness of the notion of constraint, because here some of our past experiences can play a constraining role in allowing the testimony of other people to contribute to our imaginative processes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was one of the crucial things I was thinking about when you were speaking, is the thing that allows us to give added validity to testimony that we hear is our evaluation of the individual themselves. And this is why I think a lot of people are able to change their beliefs about a particular topic when a loved one has a particular experience that they don't identify with before.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are plenty of stories of legislators whose children end up being queer, and then they change their stance on queerness because all of a sudden they can empathize. And maybe it's that sympathy or empathy is just the process of engaging in intellectual humility, which is, to me, always when we give greater weight to evidence. So intellectual humility is that I have a set of beliefs. My beliefs in a particular domain are such that I give validity to new information that can come in. So the beliefs are sort of relaxed, they can be updated. And so this updating of priors requires the humility, and perhaps the humility requires something like added empathy. That added empathy requires something like an incorporation of that individual into my understanding myself. And maybe that there's sort of a chain like that loosens this hierarchical model of priors and then lets us update the end state.
Yeah, I really like this description. And I think, like, in a way, one thing that I want to emphasize is that, it is kind of like a chain, but it's certainly not linear. It's I would presume it's a very messed up process where all sorts of, probably we would use all sorts of different concepts to describe the processes that are happening. Yeah, empathy, imagination, updating of our prior beliefs, all sorts of things. And they kind of like are so intertwined with each other, and they kind of like all simultaneously contribute to one another, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's the great thing about a hierarchical predictive model, right? Is I could change one term way up in the hierarchy, and then there's a cascading effect. And every cascading effect I can give a term to, like, loved one cascades down into empathy, cascades down into greater information. It's just, but it's interesting how when you're building a hierarchical model, literally the changing of one term means the invocation of a lot of other folk terms and descriptions that we can use. But it is encapsulated by a much simpler change. And the causal chain is just a cascade, which, isn't necessarily linear, even though the hierarchy of the model is such, the input might cause changes at different layers at different times.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the curious thing about it, I've mentioned briefly psychedelic therapy as a case for imaginative scaffolding. And in fact, that's kind of one of the main points of Chris Letherby's book, Philosophy of Psychedelics, where he suggests that what psychedelic action is primarily about is exactly about kind of like loosening or relaxing one bit of the hierarchy. And then what happens next is the whole hierarchy sort of collapses in a way or disintegrates. And more specifically, he focuses on the kind of priors that we have about concerning our self-image, and hence the importance of his study, for example, for imagination studies in the context of empathy and imagining different experiential perspectives. Because I suppose one way to sort of think of a certain hierarchy, of priors that we have, in the way that's relevant to experiential imagination, to imagining other perspectives, is in terms of the kind of priors we have that constitute our own self-image and our understanding and our beliefs about other people and how we relate to them. Like in the case of a parent who used to have, let's say, homophobic beliefs, and then have come to change these beliefs in virtue of having a child who's queer. And so when it comes to these sort of social-based or self-based beliefs or priors, the interesting thing about psychedelic action that Letherby discusses in the context of psychedelic therapy is that, because psychedelics seem to affect some of the areas of the brain that are specifically responsible, that's how he at least describes it, responsible for the emergence of our self-representation models, because they relax those, because psychedelics affect these particular areas, and because these areas sort of encode our beliefs, simply put, our beliefs about ourselves, because these beliefs become relaxed, our entire hierarchy relaxes in a way and flattens. And this, in psychedelic therapy, the way I would interpret it, and he actually does mention, he does use the notion of imagination occasionally when he talks about psychedelic therapy, because what he suggests is that because psychedelics relax our beliefs about ourselves, for example, when a depressed person who has beliefs about their own self-worthlessness takes a certain, let's say, is administered a psychedelic, and upon receiving it, they come to realize the dysfunctionality of their belief. So this belief kind of is brought into the focus, and the person becomes aware of the fact that they have this belief in the first place, because oftentimes they're not aware of these beliefs. They become aware of it, and then they realize that, oh, that's actually not the case. That's, well, in epistemological terms, we could say, oh, that's a false belief or inaccurate belief. That's not the belief that accurately represents who I am. And then they come to revise it. And when they come to revise it, what they're doing is, well, imagining themselves being other in a way. And hence the connection, the close kind of connection between psychedelic therapy and imagination studies, and flattening of the hierarchy or dissolving of it.
I don't know if I would say that the hierarchy flattens, but I would say that the beliefs at each layer of the hierarchy are relaxed, in that the evidence that is input for any of the beliefs at any layer of the hierarchy, any of the information can carry greater weight. And I suppose it's sort of like intellectual humility at every layer of the hierarchy, but with regard to beliefs that we aren't necessarily cognizant of or actively dealing with. And I'd say the relaxing of beliefs is something that I would be more comfortable with as a term than the collapsing of the hierarchy, purely because if beliefs are going to still be prioritized relative to one another, even if the individual beliefs are relaxed in terms of the strength of the belief. In that, and I guess a really quick example of what is meant by hierarchy and how these can cascade. And we've spoken about this, but just for anybody listening, one example, a classic example is if I'm engaging with a coin, I would have to flip it to have some opinion about the coin. Maybe I form one. That's at the lowest level of the belief. If Joe gives me a coin and I think that Joe is a very honest person and we're engaging in a game together, so I trust Joe to have a fair coin, I can update my beliefs about the coin based on the fact that I think Joe is very fair. So now there's an implicit hierarchy. There's an entailment of my belief about the coin's honesty with Joe's honesty. They're entailed. But then if I learn that Joe went to Coins R Us and I know that Coins R Us only sells biased coins, then I can think, oh, okay, I can adjust it again and say Joe might have an incorrect belief even though he's honest. There's a natural cascade from Coins R Us being biased to Joe being honest to the coin. And so there's an entailment there. And so I can, if I engage in psychedelic therapy, what I think is happening is not that the belief about the coin, the belief about Joe, and the belief about the factory collapse, because that's nonsensical, because the factory has to come, the coin has to come from Joe, and Joe's coin has to come from the factory or the store. But in fact, what happens is my beliefs about the factory only selling biased coins can relax. In addition, my belief about Joe being an honest person can collapse. And so I think this is what the relaxing is more than the hierarchy itself.
Can I just before we shift from that topic, can I just ask, so I guess in that case you wouldn't think that there is domain general and domain specific beliefs? Because the reason I'm asking is because in the context of psychedelic action, for example, the seminal paper on that, the Rebus model of psychedelic action by Frist and
Conrad Harris.
Yeah, exactly. There they also talk about collapsing the hierarchy, as far as I understand, under the assumption that there is domain general and domain specific beliefs. So it seems like the kind of beliefs that you were talking about are more like domain specific in a way, whereas there is domain general beliefs, something that Chris Letheby would describe as, beliefs about how the world is most generally, and beliefs about yourself most generally, how you are. And it seems like, I guess, I'm just wondering whether the whole hypothesis of the Rebus model, that seems to have been quite influential, and the philosophical work that's been done on the basis of it, would work if we were not, as you aren't, assume that there is domain general beliefs that affect the entire hierarchy on top of domain specific beliefs, if that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, I would say what can happen is the way in which you can describe the hierarchy as collapsing is you can say that the beliefs that are interdependent, that construct the hierarchy themselves, can change. So I can have doubts about whose coin it is. I can have doubts about where the coin has been obtained from by Joe. And in this sense, the result is that it seems like the hierarchy can collapse. But what happens is actually I'm constructing some kind of newer hierarchy. And I think that when I read the Rebus model, I accept that they deal with domain generality. How I interpret domain generality is still that because they influence the hierarchy of beliefs, there's some kind of hierarchy and prioritization that those beliefs fall into. So the propagation of a belief through a network of beliefs, if that can either be called domain generality, or it can just be said that they sit at some place higher relative to other beliefs, and I might prioritize some over others. But my relaxing at every layer in between can mean that other beliefs can slip in. So it happens that it's not Joe's coin, but it's somebody else's coin. It happens that it was nobody's coin and I found it on the street. I think these kinds of ways can result in what appears to be the flattening of the hierarchy, but what actually is a shifting in where the priors are coming from.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I guess that kind of... Yeah, I'm just wondering. It's interesting that in a way, that kind of poses a certain challenge for, the philosophical work that's been done on the basis of the rebus model. Because, I'm kind of reflecting on Lathab's argument. It seems like his whole idea of, this domain general hierarchy that needs to collapse for the philosophical argument he's putting forward to go through. In a way, if we were to translate his work into what you were saying, I'm not sure it would still, like, the argument would still stand in a way. Because, it seems like he's kind of like trying to perhaps overgeneralize a little bit to make it a little bit more perhaps even comprehensible to those who don't work within the predictive processing model. That's kind of like my intuition now, having like heard everything that you've said so far. Because it seems like he wants to be focusing more on the kind of like phenomenal picture of the world and the self that we get at the end. And the kind of pictures of the world and the self that we can change through psychedelics. But whilst I feel like that kind of just like reveals the difficulty of translating from cognitive science to philosophy in a way, because inevitably you kind of just like brush away certain specificities relating to the predictive processing model and how it actually works in order to make sense of it whilst using philosophical terms of the art.
Yeah, that's fair. I've read a lot from Carhart Iris and Friston, but I haven't read Lathab's work yet. So it could be that it convinces me, or that we share the same opinion but are using different terms. So I mean, either of those things could be true. So I guess that's one of those things that we'll have to have you on and discuss it at a later point. More specifics about.
Yeah, I don't want to derail.
No, I think we can shift.
I got a feeling that when you said that you were interested in how imagination could aid learning, I got the feeling that you were talking about some more functional, specific kind of technical kind of learning instead of maybe
technical, as in
technical
terms
of making, doing or learning something that is in contrast with learning. We're starting to talk about learning about someone else's perspective. So in contrast to that, I got the feeling that in the beginning you were referring to something more on the you can
like learning know-how kind
exactly
of thing.
Know-how.
So that kind of highlights the difficulty of talking about the epistemic value of imagination in singular terms, because again the more and more people are becoming more increasingly interested in the learning of skills through imagination, but that's a whole other, which is in itself a whole other topic, and it has been related to embodiment that we've discussed as well. So in a way, let's kind of like the technical side of when it comes to learning certain technical skills. I guess. I wanted to start with an example, but then now I'm thinking actually maybe we should start. I should just start with the preliminary kind of like note on how some cognitive scientists with whom I've engaged prefer to speak about this. So there is a few studies in sports having to do with like trying to examine how certain athletes can improve their skill with the use of mental imagery. And a couple of papers also just mention, as a footnote, we use mental imagery in the same way as philosophers use imagination. So basically when I say with the use of mental imagery, that just means with the use of imagination, just to clarify this. And so they ask this, and there is a bunch of studies examining how it happens in ballet, for example, in golf. I think another, of course, very prominent example would be climbing. And actually climbing has been adopted by philosophers, and they'll say about it as an example in the epistemology of imagination, and they'll say about this in a sec. But before we get there, so in cognitive in these experiments that I've just mentioned, the interesting thing is that so the basic idea is that an athlete receives a script from their coach. And then, so where the coach is expected to describe the kind of thing they need to imagine in as many details as possible. So you're actually given a proper instruction where like, you imagine yourself standing let's say in front of a rock, and you have to imagine each move that you're making on the rock whilst how you're gripping to each of the holds, how your body feels, how you're balancing your body weight, and so on and so forth. So you are supposed to ideally, and that kind of like has to do with also you practicing your skill of imagination along the way. Ideally, you're supposed to imagine your experience of, let's say, climbing a rock as if you were actually having the experience of climbing a rock. Obviously not, you wouldn't be able to imagine it exactly the way you would actually experience it, but yeah, you have to be as precise as possible. And that's how you're expected to kind of like, improve both your skill at climbing and your imagination, of course. But yeah, primarily the focus is on, learning how to climb. So the technical, learning a certain technical skill. And in these studies, the consensus is that, you do learn. And there is people do come to improve their skills through the use of mental imagery. I don't remember the details at this point, but philosophers kind of like have taken that up and have started studying various conditions under which you come to learn how to, let's say, climb a rock, or how to hit a golf ball, or how to swim, for example. In fact, I've personally been really curious to see how that works, experientially speaking, and I've tried, because it's not just about imagining, it's also about actually also watching videos, for example, and recording certain visual imagery, for example. And I've myself tested it for swimming. And so, because you kind of like, as you're watching a video and as you're recording a certain visual image, or recording, it's just loosely understood, you acquire a certain kind of like basis for then imagining how to swim. And then when you're actually swimming, your skill improves partly because of this imaginative process that you engage with, which is, it's a very interesting thing in itself. And I feel like that's another, as I've said, it's another field of study of imagination that we could dedicate a lot of time researching. But in the case of philosophy and embodiment, to kind of like tie it a little bit to our previous conversations, there is this embodied philosopher, and I think he's a cognitive scientist as well, Sean Gallagher, if you might have heard about him. So recently with another author whose name I don't remember, unfortunately, they wrote a paper about embodiment in imagination and how embodiment facilitates epistemically useful imagination. And one of the central examples they use is climbing. And here they kind of touch upon two different things as far as embodiment is concerned. So on the one hand, when you're climbing or trying to imagine how to climb, your imagining is kind of embedded in the environment already. Like, consider actual climbing athletes, right? When you see an athlete in front of a wall before lead climbing, for example, you're usually given some time to stand in front of the wall and do this. And in a way they say, your imagining is constrained not just by the dispositions you acquire through imagining, but also by your actual movements in the external environment as you're imagining. And this, like, your bodily movements help you improve your imagining, and they do constrain it also as well, but in a good way. It's like not the kind of constraining function that we've been discussing previously. It's more like facilitating constraining function of your body, literally, and of course of the contributions your body makes to your cognition otherwise, and to the kind of priors you acquire through your embodiment as well. So that's like kind of like just to relate this to what we've already discussed, but I think it's definitely a very interesting avenue to consider, and I might get there at some point. But one at a time. You can't really focus on all sorts of imaginings at the same time, because even within the branch of sensory imagination, all of them still are different, and the kind of epistemic goods you acquire are also very different. Like when you imagine the perspectives of other people, you want to understand how they feel and what kind of mental states they have, roughly put. When you're imagining how to climb a rock, you want to know, how to climb a rock, and that's a completely different kind of epistemic goal that you are after, in a way. So there's a lot of differences in between these cases, and I don't think they can be studied all together, because there is different conditions, there is different limitations posed by our cognitive capacities on these imaginings, and they're just very different. Kind of like circling back to the very first point that I made, which is that imagination is extremely heterogeneous, and because of that you can't really study it.
Yeah, it's
in general terms.
just to lend credibility to that. Athletes have been watching tapes for decades, and there was actually, I don't know if the literature is citing it as well, but there are a series, like a whole battery of studies from the 70s and 80s demonstrating this with tennis, boxing, and American football. So they had actually conducted large-scale studies over long periods of time where teams watched tapes of their prior performance and also the performance of others, and then teams which didn't. And they basically showed a very robust effect of the impact of watching tapes. So that is, I'd say, a pretty established effect in cognitive science from like 40 years ago. So it's phenomenal to see how just watching somebody do something doesn't necessarily give you the skill, but it can definitely give you a better understanding of the skill if you don't have it at all. And if you have the skill, so there's a bunch of neuroimaging studies as well showing that if you are capable of doing a particular physical activity and you are watching somebody else do the physical activity, you have a much more robust set of motor activity in your brain. So you are very likely more able to accurately map what exactly it is that you're seeing. So that's quite phenomenal. In the same way that when chimps watch other chimps do things, we can see that very particular areas of their brain light up. And there's this sort of mapping of other individuals and the tools that they use onto their own imaginings of themselves, which is quite phenomenal. And again, I mean, a really robust finding. So it's this really incredible thing of the type of information that we perceive isn't just a fact of the matter, isn't just I watched individuals engage in this activity. It's actually a much more embodied experience of watching, where it's not just this person ran from point A to point B, but I've reconstructed the running as well. And that's a completely different way to watch sports. That's what we're doing. I guess the knowledge of that is a completely different way of watching sports.
It's really interesting you should mention it in this particular way, because that's basically Ryle's argument for know-how.
Right.
Because, when Gilbert Ryle, the philosopher of the 20th century, he was one of the central figures in philosophy who argued, that knowledge-how is not only not reducible to propositional knowledge, like knowledge of facts, but also it's prior and more fundamental than knowledge of facts. And in fact, in a way, there's like a whole bunch of terms that he uses that kind of like all lunge onto each other, because for him, knowledge how is also deeply intertwined with understanding. In fact, you knowing how to do something presupposes that whilst witnessing it in another person, just like when you're watching sports, whilst having a certain expertise, that your know-how will enable your understanding of what exactly is happening when another person is trying to exercise the ability or the disposition, the know-how disposition that you already have yourself. And that's, it's kind of like the same way of describing it, and that just emphasizes how deeply, know-how and understanding are intertwined, and that also suggests a very non-factual / non-propositional reading of understanding as such. Because I'm just wondering, kind of, I would be really curious to see how this particular conception of understanding that we find in the cases you were describing and in Ryle, and that seems to be one and the same thing in a way, how it would launch into, for example, cases of understanding other people. Because, if we understanding non-factually, that really shifts our attention toward completely different features of how we relate to others and empathize with them as well.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if this, I guess, two components. One is, I don't know if this set of studies has been conducted, but when kids watch the Olympics, there can be a certain set of excitement, but this is purely anecdotal, right? What I'm about to say. Kids don't have the same level of amazement at watching the Olympics, and it might be because they don't know that they can't do everything yet. And they don't know that humans can't just fly through the air casually. But when you're an adult and you realize that I can't do 10 backflips, I can't do one backflip. So there's no way I can do 10 simultaneously. So when I watch somebody do that, I'm amazed. the kid's like, all right, but they're dragons and stuff. So what's the difference? If you believe in Santa Claus and flying reindeer, then probably somebody doing 10 backflips in a row is slightly less impressive. So it might be that the know-how, the know-how of your lack of know-how, right? You know that you have lack know-how. Is what allows for a certain type of amazement when you watch people do phenomenal feats. And to the second point you made, I think that tracks with all of the limitations we see in terms of social engagement. Of if you've never had a boss that was harassing you, whether verbally or sexually or whatever. It can be harder to empathize of what it feels like to even walk into the office, right? Or if you've never held a job in an office building, it can be hard to really communicate what that is to somebody. I find that in academia a lot, as somebody who's had a job in an office and worked in corporate life, and working in academia. It's very hard to reconcile these two things of what is it about a cubicle in a corporation, going there every day. Why is that so much more crushing than working in academia? So yeah, and I do, unless you have an immediate follow-up, which feel free to. One thing that I would love to quickly go over is the set of studies that Guilherme's doing, because I think that imagination, the way that you're treating imagination is sort of important there, because it's the engagement of two individuals. And one person has information while the other one doesn't. So one is, I'd like you to respond if you have anything to respond to. And if not, do you want to quickly touch on anything that you could get Maria's perspective on? Because I think that there's a really cool element there.
Yeah, it actually, you caught me on the back foot now, because I haven't been thinking of it as related to imagination at all.
Neither have I, but now it seems relevant.
Well, okay, yeah. I'm working on asymmetry of information, and what I'm betting on basically is on the capacity of maybe then in this sense creating a mental representation of what someone else has in their mind, right? So and then solving a coordination problem together. I think that's as far as it goes, because I learned a lot about imagination from the philosophical perspective from you now. And maybe I would need more time to put pieces together, but yeah, I haven't thought about that.
Okay, then let me try.
I also
please,
have
please.
a quick thought.
Yes,
but
yes.
maybe, yeah.
No, you go.
But it's just like, just guessing, really. But I'm just thinking the way you were describing it, probably it's a completely different thing. But if it's not, then this interpretation could be possible. So because you were saying like, kind of like constructing a mental representation of the kind of information that another person has, it reminds me, do you remember all of these old studies of, what was it, mind reading in autistic children?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of similar. It seems like it looks like a similar kind of like setup when you're shown, was it that you're shown a screen and then like I think it was something with the doll, when like whether the doll is like in one of the boxes or something like that, was it? Yeah,
it's related. Well, there are different ways to solve coordination problems. One of them, yes, is using recursive thinking. Mm-hmm. So reading the mind of the reader. And that's related to theory of mind, yes.
Because, if it's related to theory of mind, then that would present like a sort of like direct link to imagination, because, that's basically just another area in which, according to philosophers, experiential imagination, imagining, mental states of other people, has been involved just in the same way it is involved in decision-making processes for yourself, for example, what to do with your future, and imagining other people's experiences. So it's kind of like I feel like it would just fall into the same category in a way, because you're basically ultimately you're after a very similar thing in all of these cases, where what you want to get at the end of the day is shift, sort of like get to leverage the information you have to get the mental representation that another person has, I suppose.
Yeah, but I don't know how to compare that, but how to make a contrast between that and prediction. So, well, I might have an expectation of what someone else will do based on some expectation that I have that people usually do, and then I predict that this other person is going to do like that, so I do something in relation to it, right? So it's a straightforward kind of predictive process of step by step. So I don't know if that involves a certain or requires a certain mental imagery.
Mm-hmm. It seems like from how Ohan's nodding, that's exactly what he's thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, because you and I have spoken extensively about predictive processing and imagination, and one also important component of this is not only is there an information asymmetry, but there are also games in which there is an asymmetry in outcome, and I think that is a really important thing of how people will attempt to predict others' behavior. Because the predicting of others' behavior, I think in the way that you've been using imagining, for me, includes how individuals might anticipate the behavior of others. So in this way, any game theoretic thought is imaginative in that it requires one for me to empathize with the other, not necessarily because I want to be sympathetic, but because I want to anticipate their behavior. And so this form of empathy is a different form. It can be collaborative, but it can also be non-collaborative empathy, right? Like I'm attempting to access the experience of another. So this is the way in which I was thinking, where you have information asymmetries, which can lead to outcome asymmetries, and then also how you can have power asymmetries and how the engagement of each individual within a power dynamic, maybe power dynamic entails that it is unequal, but within a power dynamic will behave and then also behave with individuals adjacent to that immediate dyad. These are the ways in which I was thinking, where there is sort of an immediate usefulness from a theoretical standpoint to attach to the experiments, but then also the experiments to sort of lend credence or just insight into the theoretical understanding of imagination.
I see. I see what you're going for there. Yeah. Yeah, I guess there's something there related to maybe what are your priors on the behavior of powerful people in a certain situation, or of a knowledgeable person in a certain situation, and then you reconstruct from that prior. So you create an imagine of the outcome from there.
Yeah, and there's
maybe in that sense, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess there's this implicit assumption that I think you and I both share, maybe a lot of people share, just because of common wisdom, but that power shifts people's priors.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea that power corrupts means that the attainment of power shifts individuals' priors, shifts their behavior, and then we attempt to anticipate this change.
Yeah, definitely.
Right on. So I would say we can get closer to wrapping up, but I would ask first, what are some of the objectives that you have with the work that you're doing in imagination? And do you see yourself incorporating other elements to sort of get to that objective? Is the objective purely to understand imagination, or is it one of the stepping stones into a further element of research that you'd like to tackle?
So actually, well, I must confess, every year my research direction changes, as per, which is why, I can never for certain say whether this or that direction of research will be the one that I'll pursue in the end. But at the moment, in fact, I've just recently come up with this idea, and so far have been quite inspired by it, namely, like this whole problem of imaginative access to different experiential perspectives, and also kind of like anecdotally reflecting on my own imaginative abilities and on the abilities of others, how people, in their folk psychological terms, how they describe their imaginative abilities and what they try to do with them, what kind of like use they put them into, has made me think about, the question of why are we mostly so bad at imagining?
Hmm.
What makes us bad at imagining different experiential perspectives? How can we improve as imaginers? How we make our skill of imagination better? Of course, depending on the kind of pursuits we want to follow. I guess when it comes to imagining, when it comes to learning a skill, for example, that what might not be as crucial or important, because for athletes, they would probably be fairly skilled as imaginers as well, although I guess it kind of depends as well. But I'm kind of like interested, in more like ordinary folk who are not ingenious imaginers, which some philosophers focus on, for example. Like Kind is very invested in ingenious imaginers like Temple Grandin, for example, who's this autistic person who's been doing a lot of fascinating engineering work just in her head. And then obviously creating the products, but without any sketches. And it is really fascinating. But I'm more like interested, like we as ordinary people, what can we do to make our imagination better? How we can flatten our priors? Exactly. What kind of what kind of techniques or methods we can use to make our imagination better? Like one case in psychedelic therapy was psychedelics, right? In the case of specifically for therapeutic purposes, for example. But of course, there are other methods and techniques we can use in more or less like our ordinary life outside of the therapeutical context, for example, to make imagination better, to flatten the kind of constraints we have on imagination. Just basically kind of like, that's the direction I'm trying to go for, which is, how we can imaginatively scaffold what's required for it and how to become better.
Cool.
Then I will ask something that Guilherme normally asks, which is...
Oh, yeah, but I thought that was...
No, I want to... Because you normally also ask, which I love, what's the thing that's driving you?
Oh, yeah.
Outside.
I think, I did it at the beginning. Kind of know the question.
Yeah.
But that's a good one. Yeah.
It is a good one.
Well, what's the thing that is driving you?
That is driving me?
Yeah. Why were you doing what you're doing?
Yeah.
Well, I'm pretty bad at imagining, it turns out. I was told so, at least. Especially at imagining the perspectives of other people. My experiential imagination is pretty bad. I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm so invested in the topic. But I guess, curiously enough, but I feel like, I suppose, unlike scientists, as a philosopher, I'm just following a typical philosophical path, which is turn to your introspection, see what's going on there, and then start asking questions that ultimately would lead you to the point of realizing that your introspection is false and unreliable,
Okay, good.
Right on.
Like that.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much, Maria.
Thank you so much.